As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
Wars today are 80 to 90% informational, only 10 to 20% violence. Now that was said before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Not sure if that assessment may have changed, but hopefully that reinforces just how significant these events have come to be seen on the part of our competitors, and China views these events in much the same way, and also reinforces that central importance of information as a weapon of warfare and as a weapon of competition.
From the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, welcome to episode 13 of the Security Nexus Webinar, titled Competing in the Gray Zone. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army and professor here at DKI APCSS. The lines between war and peace are blurring. Welcome to the Gray Zone, where nations compete with a powerful mix of ambiguity, covert operations, and aggression that falls just short of open conflict. This isn't simply espionage or propaganda as we previously knew it. The gray zone is where the rules bend, technology is weaponized, and democracies find themselves challenged in unprecedented ways. Let's look at some stark examples. Ukraine. Even before Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, we saw years of cyber attacks, disinformation flooding social media, and even unmarked little green men seizing crucial territory in Crimea. It was warfare, but not the way we were used to seeing it. Elections. Foreign powers meddling in elections isn't new, but today it's supercharged. Bots amplifying extremist voices and hacked emails released strategically. These aren't bombs, but they can sow chaos and damage trust in the hearts of democratic systems. And I've seen it firsthand. In 2016, as the Secretary of the United Nations Military Armistice Commission in Korea, I oversaw armistice supervision of a successful operation to repel a fleet of Chinese fishing vessels from the Han River estuary. Now, this gray zone activity targeting the Korean Peninsula's inland water highlights real-world challenges and complexities of gray zone tactics. How about the South China Sea? China's actions here are a masterclass in gray zone tactics. Artificial islands, swarms of fishing boats that are really maritime militia, lasers blinding pilots. It's designed to gain territory without triggering a full-scale war. The gray zone is attractive to powerful nations because it offers plausible deniability, erodes confidence, and blurs the boundaries of international law. This trend is deeply alarming, and we need experts who understand this new era of conflict. The gray zone isn't just a threat between nations. It strikes at the core of democracies when citizens doubt the legitimacy of elections on their institutions appear paralyzed. The crucial trust that underpins society is eroded. Authoritarian states understand this and exploit these vulnerabilities with precision. What's worse? The gray zone is designed to confuse. It leaves us debating and asking questions like, was that cyber attack serious enough to retaliate against? Can we truly attribute that economic pressure to a single nation? This ambiguity complicates responses and slows down the very decision-making processes democracies rely on. The old playbooks no longer fully apply. We can't simply build more tanks or strengthen treaties when the attacks are coming through social media, underseas cables, or seemingly legitimate business dealings. This demands a whole new approach, grounded in understanding this unique type of competition. That's why discussions like this are so important. The stakes are simply too high to remain unprepared. We're fortunate to have a leading expert in this field, Dr. Sam Mullins, here with us today. Sam, welcome. Glad to have you here.
James, pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
I think maybe we could start if you would just tell us your story and tell us how you came into this field.
Absolutely. So I probably come at this from a slightly different angle to most people. I started off studying investigative psychology, looking at what drives bad actors essentially, ranging from criminals to terrorists, but also looking at the psychology of military and police responses and things like that as well. So from there, I focused most of my career primarily on issues of terrorism, counterterrorism, and closely related challenges. Certainly that is part of the gray zone, as you know, when we look at the non-state actor contributions in this space and some of the ways that states will work by, with, and through non-state actors as well. I went on to do the PhD then, focused on counterterrorism primarily. Following that, I was very lucky to be picked up by our sister institution, George C. Marshall Center, over there in beautiful Garmisch Park in Partenkirchen, Germany.
It's a beautiful spot.
It is indeed, and so there I was focused on CT still, but at the same time exposed to a great many Russia experts, obviously at that institution. Following that, I was lucky as still. I won the lottery. I was picked up here at APCSS in Hawaii, and although I still do keep an eye on what is happening in the terrorism space, and certainly, unfortunately, that is still very much a problem today. Perhaps that's a discussion we can have another time. But of course, we're also looking at a changing world. We are living in a world of intensifying great power competition.
Yes.
And along with that comes increasing gray zone competition. And so in particular, since moving here, I've been focused more and more on those issues. And a few in particular specific issues that I've looked at there have been, again, looking at the way that states are utilizing a range of non-state actor proxies, not just your violent non-state actors, but a range of non-violent proxies as well. Looking also at the implications of climate change for gray zone competition, which is something which is we're seeing impacts of this now, and will only obviously intensify in future. And then third and finally, kind of more recently, been looking at this entire idea of building whole of society resilience to gray zone challenges and threats. So in a nutshell, that's it, and certainly looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Well, let's take it then. Let's start by seeking to better understand the gray zones. The concept of the gray zone challenges traditional notions of conflict, and it resides in the space that really is neither peace nor war. So here's a question. How should we conceptualize the gray zone in today's geopolitical context?
Yes, okay, so the caveat here, obviously, it's a contested term, it's a criticized concept, often for lacking analytical clarity and a certain amount of utility. But it's a concept and it's a term that's here to stay. And so I think that what we can do is try and flesh out that concept a little bit more, give it some clarity, and hopefully that can make it a little bit more useful. So I'll try and do that as briefly as I can in 3 steps. The first of those is that we can look to some of the other concepts and practices that are out there which are also contested, but that can help us to think about sort of where the upper and lower limits of that gray zone lie. So if we look at the upper limits, I would say that's a little bit more easily done. We're trying to differentiate it from conventional conflict, right? And so we can look at concepts like hybrid warfare, which really overlaps at that upper edge. It's a combination of both conventional and irregular means, kinetic and non-kinetic. We have concepts like irregular warfare, which would be immediately adjacent to that, and that's looking at asymmetric, deniable, indirect means, for instance, to both military and non-military. Now, what's in some respects harder, but I think also really important to do, is to think about where does the lower edge of that gray zone lie? How do we think about what is the difference between acceptable forms of interference versus unacceptable forms of acceptable forms of influence versus unacceptable forms of interference, right? And here we can look at concepts like malign state influence or foreign interference. And there's some pretty good set of criteria that's been put forward by the Australian government in particular. And what they define here is activities that are coercive, corrupting, covert, or deceptive, and which run contrary to the interests, the values, or the sovereignty of a targeted state. Now, that's a pretty good starting point, I think, for starting to clarify that part of it. Now, the next piece then, part 2, is we can try and think of this as a continuum. And to refer to it, there's a good report by some RAND researchers, Lyle Morris and colleagues, that does exactly this. So at the high end of this spectrum of activity, we have a lot of things which are aggressive in nature. They're more likely kinetic. There is a direct discernible impact. It's things like you mentioned, where there is, for instance, acquisition of territory, the annexation of Crimea being obviously archetypal sort of example of that. It can include some of the for instance, use of military threats, incursions into territory. Certainly maritime militia can fit into that category as well. Uses of organized criminals, a variety of other tools and tactics, which either have a lethal component to them or have a very, very high risk where that could be the case. Now, as we move down the spectrum, what we find is that things are less kinetic, they are harder to attribute, and especially at the lower levels, we see that sometimes they're entirely legal in nature, and that can be hard just to figure out what is the nature of the threat and what is happening. So at the medium, kind of moderate level, we have things like political coercion and interference. We have things like elite capture. We have various acts of both physical and cyber-based sabotage, and of course cyber-based acts of espionage and so on as well, and other forms of interference there. Economic coercion, and more importantly economic subversion, I would argue, also fits in that sort of middle end of the spectrum, where some of those activities, again, are legal, but nevertheless can be very hostile in nature and can have a very significant negative impact on national security, right? Once we get down to the lowest end of the spectrum, we're talking about persistent activities that are happening all of the time, every day. That's where you have, for instance, disinformation, now ubiquitous in today's society, right? We also have various attempts to infiltrate, co-opt, subvert, sometimes mobilize diaspora populations or segments of those populations to infiltrate international media organizations, education, civil society organizations, and so on, and to utilize those for political objectives. So that spectrum, again, that's a very brief survey of it, but it gives you a sense of the broad range of activities, ranging, again, at the lowest end from entirely legal, non-kinetic, all the way up to very high-end kinetic activities. The third and final piece to this is to come back to some of the things that you talked about in your opening remarks, and that's to talk about, okay, regardless of what labels we apply to this or what we call it, what are the defining features of these activities? We can list a whole bunch of these things. I'm going to point out one, and you mentioned it already, that is ambiguity. All of these actions in some way, shape, or form are attempting to create and exploit ambiguity, to create uncertainty, to delay effective decision making in order to allow the aggressor to advance their objectives incrementally if need be, without triggering a threshold for a meaningful response. Now, typically, we think of that as in we want to stay below the threshold of a conventional military conflict, and that is absolutely the preference. I would also argue it is designed in general at those lower levels to stay below, for instance, a law enforcement threshold for response or some other form of response. Again, to allow that incremental advancement of objectives, to allow essentially that concept of winning without fighting.
That was fantastic. It was actually almost a masterclass in understanding this. It seems, if I pull just a bit on your term of ambiguity, I was thinking as you were speaking that sometimes I think you tell me if it's right, but we see this as ambiguity is into attribution, who did it? But then there could be, well, we know who did it, but what are they actually trying to do? And so ambiguity of intent, is that sound?
Exactly right. So it's multiple kind of levels, multiple kind of pieces to this, and exactly those two key elements. It can be figuring out what is the intent, is it hostile? It can be figuring out who is responsible or who is really responsible, for instance, for a set of activities. And again, all of that, what that does, it makes it difficult, it makes us hesitate, it means that we don't necessarily intervene, and all the while those objectives are advancing. So exactly right.
So it feels like gray zone activities may be increasing, and so I mean we hear a lot of these days about states that are competing with one another on this continuum as you described it in gray zone. So I guess I just ask you then, is gray zone competition increasing, and if so, what do you think why is that the case?
Sure. So obviously what we're talking about is not new. You know, gray zone competition is as old as competition, right? I would argue, however, that we are in fact now seeing an increase in gray zone activities for a variety of reasons. Partly it's that broader context I talked about, the intensification of great power rivalries and what comes with that. I think it has been also sort of perversely incentivized in the post-Cold War era through a combination of successful conventional and nuclear deterrence, along with the rising economic costs of war. And notwithstanding the war in Ukraine, we have seen a decrease over time since World War II in conventional military conflicts, right? And so what that does is that incentivizes other means of competition, other means of pursuing your objectives if you're so inclined. And so again, that incentivizes gray zone activity to some extent. You add to that some of the opportunities that are afforded by advances in globalization, advances in technology that create all kinds of new opportunities. And again, that creates a strong set of incentives for if you like, playing in this space.
Yeah.
The final piece to this, James, or I would argue it is probably the most important. And that is understanding the way that our competitors have come to view some of the important geopolitical developments since the end of the Cold War. In particular, and there's more than just this, but I think this is the centrally important kind of aspect to it, and that is Russia and China's perceptions, especially around the so-called color revolutions. So this was the series of anti-autocratic, pro-democratic protests and uprisings that we saw in Georgia and Ukraine and the Middle East and North Africa. Now, over time, Russia and China have come to view these not as a series of bottom-up led demands for better governance, but instead as a top-down Western orchestrated conspiracy using largely non-kinetic, non-violent means to exploit the protest potential of these populations and designed to overthrow autocratic regimes. There's a very famous speech that was given, published an article in 2013 by the Russian Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, and in it he talks about the blurring of these boundaries between peace and war and the importance of non-kinetic means for achieving strategic effects. In it, he is not talking about Russia's way of war. He is focused really on his perceptions of the Western way of war as he sees it, and specifically these color revolutions. Now this, and it's hard to overemphasize, I think, how important these perceptions are. Certainly within Russia, this has been debated amongst their top military leaders and thinkers to such an extent that at times they've certainly emphasized the importance of non-kinetic and informational means as being more impactful, more effective than conventional military force, and to such an extent that they have sometimes danced around, they never quite said it, but came close to implying that not only was the character of warfare changing, but perhaps even the nature of warfare was changing as well. And and if you're familiar with Clausewitz, that is a pretty profound, again, they haven't outright argued this, but they've come very, very close to it. Very good book, actually, called The Russian Understanding of War by Oscar Jonsson. Highly recommend that to anybody listening. And that really digs into this in detail. To give you one other quick example of this, James, to reinforce the point. Another senior Russian general, Andrei Kartopolov, had said, wars of the 20th century were 20% violence, 80% violence to 20% information. Wars today are 80 to 90% informational, only 10 to 20% violence. Now that was said before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Not sure if that assessment may have changed, but hopefully that reinforces just how significant these events have come to be seen on the part of our competitors, and China views these events in much the same way, and also reinforces that central importance of information as a weapon of warfare and as a weapon of competition.
You've said a lot there. You're talking about the Cold War. I spent the first decade of almost 4-decade military career in the Cold War before the fall of the Soviet Union. It's interesting to hear us, a little nostalgia for the good old days. I don't remember them being the good old days when it was going on, but it seemed to have a degree of clarity between what was going on. So let's pull just a minute on this historical evolution of the gray zone tactics. I mean, to use your own words a little bit, I mean, this is not novel. We have seen some of these things through history, but they're evolving with time to adapt to, as you said, the new geopolitical realities and the technological advancements that are beset us. So maybe I'll ask you this. Could you discuss the evolution of gray zone tactics, mainly focusing on modern technologies and how that has transformed these age-old strategies?
Yes, yes. Yeah. So as you said, certainly been around for a long time. We can, find examples of everything from fake news to, economic coercion, the orders warfare itself, and certainly during the Cold War, a period of very intense gray zone competition, of course. I think that obviously a number of things have happened to transform the way that these activities are conducted in this space. Let me kind of give you a Cold War anecdote then, James. Maybe you'll have some nostalgia around this. So, during the late 1980s, the CIA was providing covert support to the Solidarity movement in Poland, right? So a workers' union that had gotten involved in essentially agitating against the Communist Party at the time in Poland. And one of the ways that they wanted to do this was to support their propaganda and informational capabilities, right? Yeah. So to do that, they provided them with a printing press. And or to get that printing press there, they had to dismantle it into all of its component parts in London, smuggle all of those individual parts over into Poland, rebuild it, and then print out a bunch of leaflets, right? And so the reason I share that now is obviously to think of that in today's context is almost ludicrous, right? In terms of how we had the access and the ability that we have to spread and disseminate information in particular. As a quick side note, the book I'm drawing on for that particular example is a book called The Folly and the Glory by Tim Weiner. Highly recommend it. Great place to get into if you're interested in the history of all this. But obviously, again, it's globalization has transformed the space that we operate in. It's the interconnectedness of our societies, economically, politically, and so on. The fact that we have diaspora populations, businesses, all these are things happening, or transnationally. And states can now reach across borders so easily and push buttons, pull levers in ways that either they couldn't do before or which were much more difficult to do, right, than in the past. And obviously the internet and social media haven't played the sort of central role, I think, in all of that. If we look at what the internet has done, it has changed espionage. No longer do you have to wait for information, for instance, to be in transit to be able to intercept that. You can access that data at rest on a server or on a machine in another country around the world. You can manipulate, destroy information systems around the world, including to manipulate things like critical national infrastructure. And of course, you can disseminate, as we were talking about, information on a global scale now. So much more easily, so much more rapidly than when you could ever even imagine in the past. And what's important, I think, to bear in mind here is it's the ease of that, it's the lack of cost, and it's the lack of risk involved. And that makes it so hard to deter these activities, and it makes it so much more attractive, I think, to states that want to use those capabilities.
Wow. I loved your story about the printing press smuggling into Poland. Reminded me, 2 weeks ago, met with our colleague Beth Kuntz. We talked about the information environment and how that is, a trifurcation of our cognition, the content we're developing, and the technology. And so whether the technology was, of course, as simple as a printing press or much more complicated it is today, the environment is evolving, but the environment has been an environment. I want to pull just a bit on Russia's gray zone operations. We've talked about that a few times now. They've been at the forefront of using gray zone tactics. I loved your example about in 2013 the quote you gave about gray zone, maybe not named that. I think that was 2 years before the U.S. SOCOM actually came out with its gray zone paper or white paper, I guess it was. And stuck between then, of course, is Russia's gray zone tactics. Successful ones have taken over Crimea, right, in 2014?
Yes.
And so Russia has been using this for some time. So leveraging a mix of disinformation, cyber operations, economic pressure, to achieve its strategic objectives. So I might ask you this then. What are the key characteristics and objectives of Russia's gray zone operations, and how do they impact Western security and political stability?
Sure. So, again, you touched on this already. It's important to recognize, to bear in mind that Russia is active across that entire spectrum of activity that we talked about, right? So in some respects, it's quite comprehensive. We tend to focus, of course, on the real big high-profile actions like the annexation of Crimea and so on, and for good reason, but they are active across that entire spectrum as well. So with that in mind, though, I will highlight a couple of things which I think are distinguishing in terms of Russia as we can compared to some of the other actors. So one is related to Crimea and other activities. They are particularly active at the aggressive end of the spectrum. Yeah. They are particularly willing to accept the risk of escalation at that level. Sometimes, as we saw in Ukraine, eventually escalating above the threshold of war. And in operating in that space, again, it's a variety of different actions. To give another couple of examples, for instance, we look at Russia's use of private military companies like the Wagner Group and others. Yeah. And it's important there to bear in mind their use of private military companies is very, very different to any other countries. Deliberately keeping those PMCs, or ostensibly PMCs, illegal the entire time that they were utilizing them, to add to that sense of plausible deniability, to keep them literally in a legal gray zone the whole time that they're acting, and to again, to sort of make it easier to use them across a range of different spaces. So very, very aggressive in their use of application of PMCs, aggressive in their territorial acquisitions, also aggressive, for instance, their use of organized crime gangs, which were part of the annexation of Crimea and the Donbass in Ukraine, and also utilizing organized crime actors, for instance, to conduct political assassinations in Europe. So very, very active at that aggressive level. I think much more willing than other actors to escalate above that level if they feel the need to do so. And so certainly that's been one of their defining features. The other piece to it, though, is almost at the other end of the spectrum. Of course, it's all combined, and that is their heavy reliance and use of disinformation. It is hard to overstate how central that is to the Russian approach to gray zone competition. It grows out, certainly at least in recent history, of their approach during the Cold War, of course, when they utilized so-called active measures and disinformation as part of that. And it's a completely different philosophical understanding or approach to the concept of truth. In a sort of a Western context, we tend to think, well, there's a verifiable truth, and it's based on evidence of fact, and we can show that, and of course, everybody will be convinced by that. And the Russian approach, to quote Vladimir Putin, is there is no truth. And so it's putting out their disinformation narratives, sometimes even competing with one another, simply to divide and weaken and sow chaos. To borrow the Soviet terminology, it's designed to strengthen contradictions. Any targeted society, whatever your weaknesses or vulnerabilities are, they will attempt to pick up on that and to amplify that through disinformation and through other means in coordination. So very, very important part of that. I'll add very briefly, I think we're thinking about some of the concepts that are utilized within these operations as well. So one of the kind of theoretical concepts that is sometimes applied or attempted to be applied by Russia is reflexive control, and that's the idea of manipulating or tricking your opponent into unconsciously acting in a way that in this case suits Russia's interests rather than their own. And we saw that, for instance, I think in the initiation of the Russo-Georgian conflict in 2008, and it's something that Russia attempts to apply, I think, more generally across some of these operations as well. In terms of the impact that this is having, obviously we focus first and foremost on Russia's near abroad. That tends to be one of their key areas of focus. They want to be treated as an equal power to the United States, at least equal. They want to absolutely control the former Soviet republics on their periphery, and they want to weaken the United States and NATO. And those are the kind of strategic objectives, I think, that drive all of this. And so obviously we see a very immediate impact on those countries in the near abroad, constantly on the defensive against political interference and disinformation. That is absolutely the case across a lot of Western Europe to a different degree as well. We saw the political interference attempts in the United States in 2016, in France in 2017.
Yeah.
We've seen allegations across Europe, across parts of Asia of political interference as well. And I think, and again, we look at, looking globally, some of their activities and their growing activities on the African continent, particularly concerning there too. And so, although we think of it as a primarily European kind of security challenge, and in many respects it is, there are global implications to all of that, and they are active at the global level as well.
Amazing. So if I were going to summarize just a bit on that, while they operate throughout the spectrum,
yes,
it is common enough for us to see them operating at the high end of aggressive activity, which is maybe perhaps a bit of a distinguishing aspect of their efforts in the gray zone. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more on this in a minute, but without delving too deep, it made me think about how if they're operating at a high intensity, aggressive end of the spectrum, and we're trying to counter that or respond to that, and we're operating more at a lower end, we'll sanction you, we'll have some diplomatic language, we'll take it to, there may be a disconnect between how the level one is operating and where the good guys, if I say that in air quotes, are willing to operate to kind of counter that.
I think that's a fair observation. Although maybe we'll come back to this, but if you match force with force in some of those cases, we're also risking a serious escalation.
I would say.
The other thing that's interesting to this, and again I'm drawn on this Oscar Janssen book, is that we in the West, we tend to think of, for instance, those non-kinetic means like economic sanctions as non-escalatory, as a way of gradually weakening or signaling and trying to sort of change the context over time or change behavior over time. From a Russian and perspective in particular, those are viewed very much as part of a warfare approach, and therefore are viewed as an escalatory measure. And so I think that's important to realize. Some of the things that we may think of as non-escalatory will be thought of in quite a different way by our competitors.
I appreciate that distinction. We think we're operating here, and it's felt way over at a different level on the continuum of activities. Interesting. Let's do a juxtaposition, if you will. So you've laid out where Russia operates in their approach to the gray zone, but how about China? And so China's gray zone strategies, especially in the maritime domain, they highlight a systematic approach to to extend its influence without overt military conflict. If you talked about how Russia did have overt military conflict. So maybe this is the question then. What are some of the key characteristics of China's gray zone activities in the Indo-Pacific, and how does that compare to what you've just described about Russia?
Sure, yeah. So let me start with a little bit of and again, China is very comprehensive and active across the entire spectrum, and in fact arguably has more of a kind of a coordinated and joined up approach even than Russia does. If we start, with a quick comparison to some of what we talked about, China is still active, I think, at that aggressive end of the spectrum. But if we look at some of those examples, whether it's, military threats around Taiwan, for instance, or whether it's, unsafe, air and maritime maneuvers, whether that's Coast Guard or whether it's militias or whatever, or some of their other kind of more aggressive activities. You look at the Doklam crisis standoff in 2017, right. They started moving into Bhutan and eventually were stood down by Indian troops. Or we look at those kind of fatal clashes that have occurred along the border with China and India. So there is still some of that activity.
There is, yes.
There are some other things we can look at. Use of organized criminal proxies in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan.
Yeah.
But you compare that to Russia's activities at that aggressive level, and they sort of pale in comparison. We're not looking at these, large scale, incursions into others' territory. We're not looking at the same risk of fatalities and so on and so on. So certainly deeply concerning at that level, but doesn't compare to Russia's willingness to operate at that level. Likewise, if you look at, for instance, China's use of disinformation, which is definitely there. You look at, for instance, spreading of false information about policies by the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan, for instance, trying to undermine legitimacy of the government. You look at spreading rumors, about disinformation about the sources of the pandemic, trying to blame the United States. So it's there, but it's not as pronounced and it's not as ingrained in their approach to all of this as is Russia's. Arguably, they're more and more taking a note from Russia's playbook as time goes on, but less pronounced. So what kind of does define it? I would say that a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned maritime. So just by nature of geography, China's gray zone competition to a large extent is in the maritime space, and again it's coordinated. You have a layered approach, right? You have maritime militia operation coordination with the Coast Guard and PLA Navy in an overwatch kind of role in that scenario. You have the artificial island building, the militarization of those structures. You have the use of, we would call it lawfare, legal tools to try and legitimize that approach. You even have, for instance, what we might call the weaponization of tourism, sending tourists to those disputed features, for instance, further legitimizing those claims. And so a layered and comprehensive approach is certainly part of what they do, and especially also, again, in the maritime space. I would argue that they are particularly patient compared to the Russian sort of approach, less willing to take the same sort of risks at that aggressive level. And then there's a couple of other tools that I think that, although Russia uses, play better to China's strength. One of those is the economic set of tools that they have to apply. Obviously, a much greater set of economic tools available than Russia has. And that includes, sometimes it's more blunt kind of version, economic coercion. We refuse to buy your pineapples or your wine or whatever it happens to be. But more concerning, again, are those sort of longer term, more subversive sort of economic efforts to gain access, for instance, critical dual use technologies, for instance, give strategic, economic, and of course military advantage over time. And those are some of the key features. Along with, I would add, I think, a different approach to political interference than Russia. Russia, certainly, again, it's all a matter of degree, but they're best known, for instance, the hack and leak type of approach combined with extensive use of disinformation. China, I think, tests most of those sorts of tools and techniques on Taiwan more first and foremost, but more generally what we see is, I think, a great deal of effort to cultivate political elites who will act in their favor. And a very good example of that, if you're not familiar with it, would be the case of Sam Dastari, who was a former senator in Australia, forced to resign in 2017 because he had essentially been compromised to the extent that he was speaking out against his own party in favor of the PRC positions in the South China Sea. So that gives you a sense, I think, of some of the tools that they've relied on and the overall kind of approach. And in terms, obviously, in the impact for the region, for the Indo-Pacific, it has created, I think, an enormous sense of concern about the security environment across the region. Certainly, as you know, the international fellows that come to our institution here at APCSS increasingly are negative about the situation, or pessimistic. They see a deteriorating security situation as a result of these activities. And along with that, of course, is the potential for escalation that again would have global implications. The final point I'll say here, though, James, is, and this applies both for Russia and China, right? And that is, the more that these states have relied, I think, on gray zone competition and coercion as a way of engaging with other states to pursue their objectives, the more that other states are starting to say enough is enough and are starting to push back. And so I think that approach can only get you so far before it starts to backfire as well.
I want to pull on what you talked about last, which these responses are how states are feeling, but I mean, that was really quite in-depth and comprehensive to help us better understand both Russia and China's approach. And so, responses. I mean, the West has been formulating responses to gray zone challenges, aiming to navigate this fine line between deterrence and escalation. I mean, those were your words earlier. And so, how effective have strategies been in countering the gray zone aggression, and where do you see room for improvement?
Yes. So, to kind of not to labor, but to reiterate that point is that, deterrence when we're talking about gray zone is so much harder than if we're talking about conventional military conflict, because if you either threaten a high-end form of escalation, it is either going to be not credible because it's unrealistic sort of response, or it's going to be escalatory. And if you are the one that escalates the situation and is perceived to be the one doing that, then you are going to lose a certain amount of legitimacy in the international court of opinion, and you will lose international support for your position, and that's going to make it much more difficult to compete effectively in that space. So to what extent have strategies to push back been effective? It is hard, obviously, to get a real sense of that, but certainly they are generally heavily criticized, I would say, on a number of grounds, but in particular we are generally slow, we are generally reactive rather than proactive, and we are often, I think, pretty poorly coordinated, especially actually even within government, and then across society, and then internationally as well. And so those are some legitimate points of criticism in terms of how we managed to deal with some of these things. And again, look at, for instance, South China Sea, how far things were able to advance, and paraphrase, some of the commentary on this, they've essentially established de facto control over that entire area, right? And you can disagree, we can debate that point. But it's looking at how slow we've been to sort of react while these incremental steps are taking place. All of that said, I think that there is plenty of case-by-case good examples where states have been pushing back and have dealt quite effectively with some of these acts, right? So I mentioned the Doklam crisis. So India stood up and China stood down in that particular encounter. It's a case of at least an individual case where they managed to deter further encroachment. We look at, for instance, France's approach to safeguarding their 2017 political elections. Taiwan's efforts more recently, right? They've done a fantastic job, it seems. Australia, I think, is doing some really good efforts. I mentioned the Story case, and since that time in 2017, they've revamped, their whole approach to and beefed up their approach to dealing with foreign interference. And I think it's there's still work to be done, but a lot of examples, I think, of good practice are coming out of that. And then there are other, states like the Philippines, for instance, starting to be a little bit more kind of willing to stand up in the maritime space, and more willing also, I think, importantly, to showcase that to the world, to video these incidents, to show people what is happening, and to expose some of that coercive behavior. So I think that what do we do to improve is, we got to look at some of those cases of best practice, as many as there are. We've got to try and learn whatever lessons we can from that, take those lessons, try and apply them as much as we can to our own circumstances. And we've got to address those fundamental questions that I talked about, those criticisms. So how do we get from being reactive to proactive? How do we become more agile and more responsive in this space? And for government, that's hard always, right? And how do we coordinate better and kind of come up with a more collective and sort of unified kind of approach to this?
Amazing. More complicated than I think I had initially thought. Let me ask you to put your futurist hat on.
Sure.
And think about the future trends in this gray zone competition. So as geopolitical tensions evolve and new technologies continue to emerge, the gray zone competition landscape seems like it's likely going to just continue to shift. So looking ahead, how do you anticipate the strategies and the tools of gray zone competition changing? And then what would nations do to stay prepared, to stay ahead? What would we do?
So as we look to the future, I think the first thing you can do is try and look at, as we were, right, a little bit about the history and how that things have evolved in that space. And one of the obvious things that we kind of observed there was obviously, it was advances in globalization, it was advances in technology that transformed a lot of the opportunities that were available. And so we can expect, and we're already seeing cases where, technological innovations and so on, where that is doing this, we're starting to see potentially another kind of revolution, if you like, in some of this activity. The obvious one there, and it's already been applied and will only get more sophisticated, and that's artificial intelligence. And that can be applied across the board, but certainly for things like political interference and disinformation in particular. And so we're certainly going to see some, I think, probably quite rapid advances there. Just over the horizon, we have things like quantum computing, which I don't even pretend to understand, but certainly is going to transform espionage and access to information and all of these things that go along with that.
Yeah.
And so certainly, the implication of that is pretty obvious for states. Is stay up to date with technology, keep an eye on what's happening, develop your own capabilities, because those same tools that are going to be used offensively are going to be so important defensively as well. And so we're going to figure out how do we work those into our counter strategies. I will add this though, we got to be careful not to look at this purely as a technological problem, not to fixate on the technology alone, because if you look at a lot of the activities that are taking place and a lot of the, I would say, successful activities that are taking place, in fact, they're not technologically based at all necessarily. Elite capture, that's taking people on lavish trips. It's either bribing them or extorting them using age-old sort of techniques that have been around forever. And so if we fixate too much on technology, we're potentially losing sight of some of these other tried and tested non-technological means, which is still a foundational part of all of this, right?
Yeah.
And then the final thing I'll say, if we're thinking about the future and how this can evolve, is, and this is drawing on this work I've done looking at the implications of climate change, and that's figuring out, okay, what are the bigger, broader sort of changes that are happening in the world? What are the mega trends that we're seeing? How are those going to either shape gray zone competition and or be shaped by it? And then what do we do about it? And I don't have time, of course, to go into all of that right now, but I will just say as an absolute basic minimum, what we need is climate literacy for our security services and for those people involved in this gray zone competition.
No, well said. No, and you're right. Time is slipping past us. I want to ask you one last question. And real simply, you've described this well. Do you have some strategic recommendations on how to get after it?
Okay. So this is the hard part, right?
It is.
What do we do about it? There's a number of things that states need to be doing, and we can kind of list those off, and it's things like developing more effective legislation, right? Looking at things, how do we deal with things like political interference and suspicious foreign direct investment and things of that nature. There are things at the sort of operational level that we need to do, and it could be investigations and prosecutions sometimes. It could be operations in maritime space, for instance. There are things economically, of course, that we need to do. We look at things like friendshoring and nearshoring, all these things that are being done cooperatively to reduce our vulnerability to various forms of economic coercion and manipulation. And so, again, we've got to look at all these different pieces of the puzzle and figure out how do we fit those together in an effective way. I will try and emphasize two things in particular, though, that I think need to be part of an effective gray zone sort of counter strategy, if you like. One of those is, and this comes back to our competitor emphasis on the importance of information, and that is that we have to have, I think, a really centrally important informational strategy, and that connects to all of the other pieces. So, for instance, operationally, if you go out and counter incursions in your maritime space, for instance, but there's no information strategy associated, it's like that old proverb, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, did it really happen, right? And so that, I think, is a key part of this. And then the other piece that I think that we really got to try and get to grips with, and I talked about whole of society resilience, right? And I talked about the difficulty of deterrence, right? By at least through threats of punishment. Another form of deterrence is deterrence by denial, in terms of denying the impact, right? And making some of those activities less attractive because there's no real reward to them. So one of the ways that we can do that is build resilience in our societies. And there are a number of different ways that can be done to build resilience to different types and levels of grey zone activity. But the big takeaway there is that we are thinking outside of just government. Government cannot do it alone. Yeah. And in fact, sometimes it's probably really not the right actor to be doing it at all.
That's a good point.
Oftentimes, civil society, private sector are on the front lines of all of this. And so we really got to figure out how do we coordinate and work better together as we approach this challenge.
Nicely said. You know, to maximize the remaining time we have, I want to transition to the audience questions. We've got about a half a dozen questions, got about 8 minutes, so let's do a lightning round. Let's talk first about the concept genesis. Where did this term come from?
Okay.
What's the story?
So to the best of my knowledge, James, and it's probably incomplete, you mentioned the 2015 SOCOM paper, the grey zone.
Yep.
Prior to that, there was at least 2 mentions in this context of grey zone in 2010, the Japan Ministry of Defense document, and also US DoD quadrennial review.
Oh, the QDR. That's right.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And so those are the first kind of, I think, more or less incidental mentions. I think the SOCOM paper certainly lit the fire, so to speak. And that was picked up very quickly also, for instance, the academic analytical community, 2016 paper by a guy called Frank Hoffman, very well known. And it's entered political, a general discourse ever since then. That's my best account of it.
You know, you're right. Secretary Gates, 2010. I mean, he did say gray zone, gray area activities. It's coming. Get ready for it.
Yeah, and you know, the idea of a grey area, you know, think about legal grey areas and so on, is not particularly new, right?
No,
it's been around since God knows when, and so this is just applying it, if you like, to a particular problem set.
Strategic metrics. How do we measure this? And how do we know we're being effective, right?
Yeah, good question. Oof. Okay, so I'm not aware of any specific set of metrics per se. I know there's a lot of data analytics and so on that people are working on to look at this. I will say this: to have good metrics, you got to start with clear goals. If we don't know exactly what our goals are, how are you going to measure how you're getting there, right? So we got to figure out first of all, what exactly are we trying to achieve, and that's going to be different for different countries, different for different agencies, different for different types of grey zone activity, right? But we have to have clear goals, otherwise we can't have clear metrics. Then when it comes to devising those metrics, we're going to make sure we don't just focus on the outputs or the activities. We've got to look at outcomes. Yeah. And we've got to combine both quantitative data, which tends to be very alluring, right? We look at things like, you know, impressions and likes and engagements on things like social media, and it can be, you know, we can draw all kinds of conclusions, but are they substantiated? So we could combine that with some kind of qualitative assessment as well. Ultimately, we've got to look at, are we changing our adversaries' behavior? But we also be careful not to have unrealistic expectations about the extent that we can do that, because I think that ultimately this form of competition is here to stay.
Nicely said. Allied impact. How does an ally's performance matter in this zone?
Crucially important, and again, may vary, right, depending on the activity. So we think about something like economic sanctions, for instance, right, that we talked about. Unilaterally, it's probably not going to achieve very much. Multilaterally, and everybody's on board, that's where you can start to potentially see more of an impact, right? There are other areas, you know, freedom of navigation operations. If you do that by yourself, you're not going to get too far, but you do it with a coalition, and then it can be certainly much more impactful. So it's important both for resources and effort and manpower. More important than that, I think it's important for messaging. Yeah. And again, it's an informational struggle, right? So we've got to have that collective approach.
Close a circle on your earlier example of the Philippine Navy and how they're putting out video broadcast of what's happening. Clearly they're trying to pull others together, so it's just not their lone voice calling foul.
Yes, and I've got to add very quickly, because I think it's a great example of cooperation in this space, is where we look at the growing cooperation, for instance, between Philippines and Vietnam. They have their own, disagreements ongoing, but they're able to put that aside to some degree to start to work on things like Coast Guard cooperation and so on.
All right, legal evolution. Talk to me about the frameworks that are trying to put some boundaries on this.
So yes, so very important, I think, to have a legal basis to it. We're seeing, I think, a proliferation of new legislation being developed, or else old legislation being revamped and strengthened. And especially we see that, I think, when we're looking at domestic activities, looking at things like foreign interference, looking at things like suspicious foreign investments and so on. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the new legislation take place. So I think that having that legal foundation is fundamentally important. I will just add as a caveat, for instance, Canada currently doing an inquiry, looking at all the political interference that's happened there in recent years. They have not yet introduced the new legislation, I think, because they're still looking at this, assessing this, and asking, are our existing laws, are they good enough? Can we reapply them to this problem set? So that could also be a solution for some states.
Well said. I think there's a lot of work that's going to have to be done in this field going forward. Civilian protection. What are government's duties to civilians against this gray zone threats that we're talking about?
Absolutely crucial. And there's a good account by a Finnish journalist called Jessica Aro, that's spelled with a J, that looks at exactly this sort of issue. Again, civil society actors, private sector and so on, they're often the front line and target of a lot of these activities. They also play a critical role in responding to and countering many of these threats, from disinformation through to all kinds of other activities. They are sometimes very directly and consistently targeted and victimized by malign state actors. And so it's critical that we protect them and that we enable them to continue the good work that they're doing.
Here's the last one, maybe the hardest: conflict escalation. You talked about it before, but how do we prevent it from happening?
Okay, so again, we have that potential for escalation absolutely there, and there's various hotspots we can look at now, right, where it can take place. One thing that's important, I go back to the RAND study, we talked about that continuum, and one thing that they've argued in that paper, I think there's some validity to this, is that at the high-end aggressive end of the gray zone, as much as deterrence is generally hard in the gray zone, at that high-end aggressive level, more conventional forms of military deterrence actually can be applied, because we are looking at some kinetic activities and some territorial incursions and things of that nature. So it may be that we can come back to some of the lessons learned and some of the tools that we have available from our conventional deterrence toolbox to be the ultimate sort of, hopefully, last stand to prevent that escalation above that threshold.
Any thoughts on red lines, articulating them? Do those matter? Do they help?
That's a tough one.
Oh, isn't it?
And there was different. Obviously, there's different viewpoints on that. Do we communicate them, or do we keep it in the gray area, in the gray zone? Right. If we communicate them, we run the risk, in particular, that if they cross, exactly that. Exactly, you got to back them up. And if you don't back it up, then you've ruined your credibility. Your deterrence completely crumbles and fails. On the other hand, if we don't clearly communicate, maybe our aggressor doesn't know where it is, right?
No, that was the line.
Exactly right. So where you find that balance is going to be very, very tough.
Oh man, well said. Well, here we go. Before we let you go, I thought maybe you've mentioned a couple books, but I wonder if there's any others, at least another one that you might recommend to the audience on those things we've discussed today.
I will. I'm going to recommend a couple real quick. Okay. So, The Defender's Dilemma by Elizabeth Brawl is a great place to start here. Very good. And another really good one is The Weaponization of Everything by Mark Galeotti. And a third one that I really, really like is Active Measures by Thomas Reed. And so, if anyone has the time to dig into all these books I've thrown out, they're all really good reads.
Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to put all the books you've noted today in the show notes. We'll add them to our page of running the list of recommended readings. Thank you for being here. This has really been illuminating. I have learned a lot. I'm sure that our guests have learned a lot. Thank you for this time.
Thank you, James. Really pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. As we wrap up, remember that informed communities are the bedrock of resilience. Our next stop in this journey is May 6th with our webinar, The Great Game of Digital Dominance, featuring Dr. John Hemmings. We'll explore how technology is being used to control populations, rewrite history, and reshape the global order. A game with far-reaching consequences. From all of us at DKI APCSS, thank you for being part of this important conversation. I'm James Minnich, and until we meet again, aloha oi. As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.